noticed something peculiar about our community, and that is there seems to be a somewhat tenuous relationship between, or I guess you could even think of, competing ideologies amongst many of us today. And that is this idea of what I would frame as a sort of Romanticism and Universalism in our community. By Romanticism, I mean that many in our community have the idea that sometime in the past there was a more perfect iteration of the Muslim community, and therefore our aspirations should be directed at either trying to recreate that past, which is a fool's errand, or we lament, right? We lament about how we are not like them. And then, as I said, there is this idea that Islam is also universal. But it's very hard to be universal if a lot of your intellectual capital is directed towards this sort of reenactment. You know, we have these things like, you know, when people go to Gettysburg and they do the reenactment, they put on their costumes and, you know. So Romanticism and Universalism make some sort of strange bedfellows. And what I've found is that while there may be a kernel of truth in the idea that communities that came before us, perhaps they were more pious. Nobody argues, of course, about the time of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions and how they were the best community. The Prophet, his family, his Bayt, right, Ahl al-Bayt, and of course his ashab, his companions. Nobody argues. I mean, after all, these were people that pledged their life, their wealth, to the support of the Prophet ﷺ. And it's actually here that I think this is the biggest problem with what I might call like a sort of nostalgic or romantic universalism, is that it mistakenly puts the emphasis of whatever perceived pureness or goodness on the time versus on the people. And perhaps why we see such a structural collapse or a structural failing today is because we are not directing our energies towards the crafting of a virtuous collective, but rather on other things, I don't know, institutions or whatnot, not realizing that whatever institutions or whatever communities or whatever groups or whatnot will ultimately be comprised of people. And therefore, without deeply looking at what was the core motivation that allowed these previous communities, particularly that early community, what allowed for the rectification of their soul, of their character, that allowed them to go above and beyond themselves, to fight against themselves and rectify themselves. was obviously a many-faceted thing we could call virtue that includes things like, obviously, you know, Iman, belief, and Tawheed, oneness of God, and Taqwa, right? This sort of preemptive way of protecting oneself from doing things that's displeasing from God, and so on and so forth, right? But also the ability to check one another. And now that we live in the age of only God judges, which is an absolutely ludicrous statement, it is very hard to create a transformative individual morality versus this sort of public, you know, milquetoast morality that we have today. So we got to think really hard about moving beyond, or perhaps not even just moving beyond, but really getting rid of this whole notion of greater times, but perhaps greater people. And maybe once we get into our heads the notion of greater people, then we can maybe get about the business of trying to make ourselves and encourage others to be greater people.